Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. In behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I want to welcome you all to this session. I am Diego Ochoa, NBSAP Forum Communications Advisor of the team. Thank you for attending the October webinar series here. This two-part webinar series explains how to use conservation planning tools such as the NBSAPs to address issues related to biosafety and bioresource trade, BioTrade, and the access to and sharing of genetic resources. This webinar will provide you clarity on how bioresource trade is different from the commercial use of genetic resources. With a focus on conservation and sustainable resource management planning, the presenters will explain how to distinguish these two separate but related concepts. They will review implementation problems of countries that have not differentiated these concepts. They will also explain how to develop ABS frameworks that uphold the spirit and objective of the Nagoya Protocol. This discussion is timely as many countries are beginning to develop national ABS frameworks. I would like to introduce the two speakers of this webinar. First, I would like to introduce Mr. Bala Krishna Pisupati. He has more than 25 years of experience dealing with issues of biodiversity, law, policy, and development. He's currently working with UNEP, coordinating actions related to biodiversity and multilateral environmental agreements. He has held positions such as Chairman, National Biodiversity Authority of the Government of India, Coordinator of Biodiplomacy Program at the United Nations University, and Head of IUCN Asia Regional Biodiversity Program. His work focuses on issues related to biodiversity planning, through which he has helped more than 20 countries develop and reviews the NBSAP. Mr. David Vivas is a legal officer in the Trade, Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development Branch, the IATC of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Environment, UNCTAD. He previously served as a Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the Trade Negotiations and Commercial Diplomacy Branch of the same organization. Mr. Vivas is an international expert with more than 20 years of experience on legal and economic issues. I would like to welcome Dr. Bala and Mr. David to this webinar session, and thank you for attending this invitation. It is a pleasure to have you both here today. As usual, before starting, I just want to remind some rules and dynamics for this NBSAP forum session. Everyone will be on mute during the presentation. That means that your microphones will not be working. This diminishes the interferences and facilitates the communication among all of us. If you have any question, please send it through the control panel in the questions tab, and I will be happy to assist you. We will have 1 hour webinar session. At the end of this presentation, we will have around 30 minutes for questions and some discussions around this topic. Please send us your questions in advance or raise your hand in the control panel. If you want to speak and the connection allows, we will open the participants' microphones to promote the interaction. This is an advice for our speakers, as many of our participants are not English native speakers, me included. I would like to remind you the importance to talk slower. This facilitates the comprehensions among our practitioners. The session will be recorded and it will be available at the NBSAP Forum website, www.nbsapforum.net. All the participants will receive an email with the link to see the presentation. Now I'm going to transfer the webinar control to Mr. David. Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you, Mr. Bala, again for attending this webinar. Please enjoy this session.
Good afternoon or morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this NBSAP's webinar. I would like to congratulate UNEP for this initiative. Today we're going to discuss two concepts, a concept that many may be familiar, such as access and benefit sharing under the CBD or the Nagoya Protocol, but it's also been there for some time, but it's not existing in any country. It exists in about 20, 21 countries, which is called BioTrade. And now we will see that there is a lot of overlap and relations among these two concepts, and also with a third pillar or block, which is related to the trading commodities derived from biodiversity. I'm going to move. The first point I would like to make that the rules on ABS changed dramatically with the entry into force of the Nagoya Protocol relatively recently, a couple of years ago. We have more than 80 ratifications right now. We will get to about 100 by the next CBD COP13 in Mexico. It's important to know that the protocol is not perfect, that the protocol is the result of a diplomatic compromise between the parties. It did not represent the highest level of ambition of biodiversity-based countries, but it raised the level of ABS obligations on the side of user countries, which was considered a balance between them. An important aspect of the protocol is that it's not self-executing, meaning even if you ratify the agreement and it's passed through your Senate, it has to be developed and implemented through national access and benefit sharing legislation or user country legislation, depending on how you want to do it. This session is not about the Nagoya Protocol, but it's always good to recall what it is about. It is like the abecedary, A, B, C, D. The first point is access, facilitated but also regulated with conditions of how it should work. You have benefit sharing, which has been somehow decoupled from access. Today, under the Nagoya Protocol, you might have situations of access and benefit sharing, but you can have situations also of benefit sharing because access has already occurred. Benefit sharing is subject to match and agreement between the parties. Perhaps the two more important novelties of the protocol, and they come somehow from the evolution through the Bond Guidelines, are the compliance aspects, including monitoring, verification, checkpoints, and enforcement. And also very novel definitions, especially in relation to utilization and derivatives, and we will be calling these a lot during the webinar. Now, BioTrade is less known, but BioTrade is a formal initiative that was adopted at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg 20 years ago. It will have 20 years. It came as an initiative to promote access and benefit sharing, not only of genetic resources, but mostly of biological resources, through economic incentives. If you want to put BioTrade today, you could consider BioTrade as one of the positive incentives to conserve biodiversity in light of the Aichi Target 3 that could make it more current. It was formally adopted in the UNFCCC and the WWSD in Johannesburg, and this is an UNCTAD initiative. Perhaps not known, UNCTAD is the trade arm of the UN. Well, many people know the WTO, which is the trade policy-making body today. In the UN, the focal point for trade and economic issues is UNCTAD, jointly with DESA. Now, what is BioTrade? BioTrade is not trading commodities. It's not necessarily also flow of genetic resources. It may imply it, but it's not directly that. We will be playing with these three concepts all along the webinar: flow of genetic resources, BioTrade, and trade in commodities. Now, BioTrade refers to activities of collection, production, transformation, and commercialization of both goods and services derived from native biodiversity. I underline this because then we won't be talking about corn in China or coffee in Colombia. We will be talking about native biodiversity that could be found in extreme conditions and has not been domesticated. Now, you do this collection, production, transformation, and commercialization activities under an environmental, social, and economic sustainability criteria. This is what makes it different. It's not any type of trade. It's a component where you have the sustainable environmental concerns, the social aspects linked to fair trade, and also it has to be economically sustainable. If not, the operation cannot continue. And BioTrade has basically 7 principles. The first 3 match with the objective of the CBD. Number 4 is social and economic sustainability. So these are activities that must generate a profit. Number 5 is legal compliance with international and national regulations, including the Nagoya Protocol and other multilateral environmental agreements. Number 6 is respect for actors' rights, including those of the owners of the land, those of traditional communities, indigenous and local communities, etc. And finally, one very important for the issue that we'll be discussing today, clarity on rights, on access and use on land, obviously, but also on resources, including biological and genetic. And now we're talking basically about 6 sectors, there might be more, that go from textiles and natural fibers to handicraft to flora and fauna for different uses, from ornamental to pets, sustainable tourism, which is a service, but also pharma, healthcare, cosmetic, foods, and carbon sequestration, which is also a service. In the map, you can see the countries that are implementing nationally BioTrade projects, and they have grown dramatically over the last 20 years, and I will evidence that in the next slide. Basically, so far in BioTrade activities, we have more than 30,000 farmers, collectors, breeders, hunters, and producers engaged, especially as the first layer of the value chain. So the first thing you need to know is BioTrade has a value chain approach, by which you go from the biological resources or genetic resources to the final product. And there will be different actors, but we involve a quite significant number of actors at the first layers of the value chain. Under BioTrade, there are more than 90 million hectares of sustainably managed land, which is very important on the agricultural sustainable criteria or forest conservation or ecosystems management, depending on the site we are doing the activity. This is an interesting number. Sales and revenues of BioTrade were in 2012 5.2 billion, and in 2010 2.3 billion. This means that this sector has been growing at a rate of about 65% yearly. This is not a small growth rate when you see that the world growth rate is less than 2 today. Also, if you compare this with the other 2 activities that we're discussing today, trading commodities, is quite still, BioTrade could be still considered a niche market. For example, if you look at international trade of fish products and seafood products, we're talking about 150 billion. BioTrade is just 5. So you can see the difference between trade of commodities coming from general biodiversity than the type of activities that imply a sustainably sourcing approach. Also, if you compare this to genetic resources under ABS contracts, we don't have precise estimations, but if you take more or less roughly all the access contracts known in the world and you try to give a monetary value or look at the monetary value included in these contracts, I don't think you get more than $20 million. So it's a very different trades in value, at least up to today. Now, here I'm going to give 2 examples of which are the BioTrade principles. Here we have principle 3. And basically, you can see in the principle that BioTrade involves activities of commercialization of genetic resources, of biological resources, and implies sustainable use. We can see that the negotiation, let me just bring this out. The negotiations must be fair, equitable, include monetary and non-monetary benefits, but especially by the weakest link in the value chain. So we are here talking about a processing activity. Income should be generated along the value chain, and there should be opportunities for all participants from the lower part to the higher part of the value chain. So there is value addition each time we move from a raw material, a plant, an extract, to a final product, whether a cosmetic, food, etc. The next The next principle is clarity about rights on access. This is very important. We need to define responsibilities of each actors, and in BioTrade it applies to both biological and genetic resources. But in BioTrade, most of the business is biological resources. But we will see that as a consequence of the Nagoya Protocol and many references in law, the scope of ABS is getting larger. It also includes clarity on access to traditional knowledge, and in both cases we have to have a prime for consent, and in both cases it should be benefit sharing and compensation. Now here we can start seeing in this slide the links between the Nagoya Protocol and BioTrade. The first thing is that BioTrade is not mandatory. BioTrade is a voluntary practice or can work as a private standard. The Nagoya Protocol, one is brought into national law and developed through national law and regulations, is mandatory, it's not optional. So biotraders have to apply ABS if they are found or their activities are found within the scope of the ABS regulation. In BioTrade, the use of biodiversity goes along value chain. We have a terminology to differentiate BioTrade from others. If you put BioTrade with capital B and C, means you are applying the principles and criteria and the standards. If you do it with small caps, for us that's trading commodities. Now, as we are using biodiversity, we can be using biological resources, genetic resources, ecosystem services. So it's very wide, the scope. In ABS, of course, we're focusing more on access and utilization of genetic resources, biochemicals, naturally occurring biochemicals, and depending on the national law, derivatives. In terms of benefits, in both cases you have benefits, both monetary and non-monetary, but the actors are different. In BioTrade, the actors are the companies in the process of that participate in the value chain, the people working, employees in the value chain, and the production is done by these actors, and the benefits are shared by these actors. So all actors engage in the process. In the case of the Nagoya Protocol, if we're talking about genetic resources or biochemicals, we're talking about access and benefit sharing with the state. And if we're talking about access and use of traditional knowledge, if defined by national legislation, we're talking about those who want access and TK holders. So as you can see, you have three types of benefits. Benefits within the value chain, benefits with the state, and benefits with TK holders. Both in BioTrade and in ABS rules, you require prior informed consent. But in BioTrade, it's not necessarily related to research and development. It can be wider, just manufacturing, processing, filtering, drying, extracting, mixing, making compositions. It implies a benefit sharing generation. In the case of ABS rules, in most of the cases, the rules are triggered where there is research and development and commercialization on the subject matter we explained, genetic resources, biochemical derivatives, and depending on the case, TK. The implementation in BioTrade is guided by principles and criteria through private standards. In the Nagoya Protocol is the law, but also the MAT, the mutually agreed terms. Now, there are not many specific laws on BioTrade, but there are many national strategies and programs on BioTrade, many of them part of the biodiversity strategies and action plans. So you can see that in the case of Peru, you can see that in the case of Colombia, Vietnam, South Africa, and others. But in some cases, BioTrade has been explicitly included in the legislation, and we'll see some cases. In the case of ABS, we have more than 60 ABS laws, and they are growing, especially if you take into account user measures. Now, while we are discussing all these, because somehow you could see, especially through the clarification on the concept of utilization, that we're not talking about genetic resources in a strict sense, meaning DNA, RNA, and functions of heredity. We might be talking about biochemicals, and there are many biochemicals that are important for the industry, including vitamins, enzymes, etc. Now, the triggers, as we were mentioning for ABS, include the object, that could be genetic resources. In some regulations, it also applies to biological resources, to biochemicals of natural origin, and derivatives, depending on the case. And we will see that with real examples. Activities, we're talking about research and development and commercialization. Neither research and development nor commercialization is defined in the protocol. It means in principle that then it could imply any type of research and development or any type of commercialization, and that had led to very broad interpretations of ABS. Research and development, you can categorize it perhaps in three categories: basic science, applied research, and regulatory research. And many companies have questions about if it applies to the three or only to some of them, and if the rules should be the same for the three or different for the three of them. On commercialization, again, what do we mean by commercialization? It's just the access and manufacturing contract, it's research and development, product development, patent filing, etc. Now, as we can see in practice, we will see that ABS rules and policies are starting to increasingly become relevant to the sourcing of natural ingredients and affect value change that generate a lot of employment and income for people in developing countries. Another point related to ABS that is important to take into account is that in practice today, it is very difficult to bring a new product or a process into the market, whether if it's a shampoo or a nutraceutical, if there is not some level of research and development at any of the three levels I mentioned, because if not, it wouldn't be new. Okay, so this is very important to take into consideration, because if we are talking to do marmalades or confiture, as the French would say, we are doing a clear biological resource use, but each time you try to develop a shampoo, when you are trying to develop a nutraceutical, you might find that you have to do different type of research and development for different purposes. Now here we have a snapshot. Sorry if the slide is too charged, but you can see clearly the comparison. Bala will walk you in more detail, but you can see through this that countries tend to have a quite different way in which they define, list, the scope, and the subject matter. So for example, in Vietnam, it focuses on genetic resources. Nevertheless, it says it includes all species and genetics specimens. So complete individuals and species as group. In the case of India, we talk about biological resources and of commercial utilization. Biological resources is larger than genetic and includes all the biological resources used for industrial purposes: drug, industrial enzymes, food, flavor, fragrances, cosmetics. So it's really, really wide. You can include, you might have to require access and manufacturing to do chocolate or to do marmalade in India, according to this law. Bala can go deeper. On Peru, you have the same, but it includes genetic resources. They don't explicitly mention biological resources. Even in the Peruvian law, nutraceuticals are excluded, functional foods, but it covers derivatives. And derivatives can be essential oils, can be fats, can be enzymes, can be vitamins, many things. So the scope is larger, the same for the Indian community. In the case of South Africa, it includes indigenous, genetic, or biological resources, so include both, and it goes even further. It says that it is covered by this regulation, the commercial industrial sectors that utilize any indigenous genetic or biological resources for biotrade or research. So in South Africa, biotrade has to comply with ABS, period, like it or not. So in Brazil, they have taken a totally different approach. This is very novel. Many of you would have seen this law. They have focused on a system that moved from the bilateral negotiation of access, contract, and benefit sharing in order to reduce the transaction cost, to try to think of more of a, let's put it this way, tax-based system by which you focus on the final product. There is less transaction cost because you only register. You don't have to negotiate conditions. There will be some fixed rates that you can discuss, but usually close to 1%. And if you bring a product to the market that is utilizing genetic patrimony of Brazil, then you will be subject to benefit sharing. It goes further in the sense that it not only talk about the plant and animals itself, but also about the genetic information. So it somehow covers some intangible aspects of genetic resources. So as you can see, and these are all like-minded countries, no? If you put them all together, they always work together in the CBD COP and are very close in alliances, and see how diverse is even among them the scope and the definitions. Here there's a slide that can help you to understand what type of research and development activities could be somehow considered to be within the scope of the protocol, from research and development of extracts of medicinal plants and identification of active compounds, doing or develop a new extraction process on one particular plant extract or animal, use biotechnology to utilize enzymes, study the action of enzymes on the human body, plant or animal breeding using biotechnology, obtaining TK from an indigenous community to guide the research and development process, etc. So these are typical things that could be considered covered by ABS. Could happen also in BioTrade, but in BioTrade you do many other things. Now, typical questions that a BioTrade company asks, or many companies ask: am I covered by the Nagoya Protocol? Well, one is the protocol, the other is the national law. The national law can go further. So basically, this is an super simplification of the reality, but let's try to go through it. If you are doing research and development in genetic resources or biochemical, yes, you need to apply the protocol. Now, if you are not doing that, you are trading, but what the output you are trading can be used for research and development purposes, you may be caught by the user country measures or the provider country measures. You might have to do diligent obligations and inform whoever is the buyer that you are selling these products for purposes others but research and development. And then you might be caught by the obligation of the protocol if you transfer for research and development purposes. If you don't transfer resources, but forget about Nagoya. Now, again, one of the novelties of the protocol that we have is user measures, international certificates, and impacts on flows. There tend to be this differentiation that I have used a lot between users and providers, but in practice, this differentiation is artificial. All countries are providers, all countries are users. Many developing countries rich on biodiversity tend to forget that many developed or industrialized countries are found among the most richest in biodiversity countries, including US, Russia, and France. For example, it's not very well known, but France has more genetic diversity than Brazil, because France has colonies and islands in front of Canada, in the Caribbean, has still a colony in South America with the same level of biodiversity of Brazil, has islands and colonies in the Indian Ocean, has islands and colonies in the Pacific. So they almost have all genetic diversity globally. Just to give you an example. So don't always think that you are a winner. You might be also a provider or a user depending on your situation. And you might be exporting or importing material, and you might have to comply with these regulations. Now, the demand for legal access may come from ABS laws, national, in the place where you're extracting the material, but it may also come from regulations in the user country asking you to provide legal title or legal origin. Now, for companies that make an effort to comply, and we have seen 2 examples recently in the Andean group, both in Colombia, that those who try to comply and comply, and once they get their international certificate of compliance, there are several now from India, South Africa, etc. These companies obtain what is called a first mover advantage in the market. They can go to any third party and say, I'm in a legal status to do this. They will be companies that won't have that advantage. And this is going to create a differentiation in the market, because companies that comply may inform authorities that others are not doing it because they had to pay the cost of getting through the whole ABS process. So they could have effects in the market. They could have effects in terms of unfair competition actions, and even in terms of litigations between the companies, especially when between the ones complying and the ones not complying. So somehow complying with Nagoya and ABS may become a comparative advantage in the market and protect you against third-party claims. Now, if we want to see a simplified view of this relationship between BioTrade, after all this talking, you can see you can have some nice picture of the person's harvesting, drying the material, filtering the material, processing, manufacturing. That's a value chain. And here you have people intervening in the country where the whole sources are found in situ, but also in other markets. So while you are doing all that, seems to be fine and not covered, but once you start engaging in research and development and at any phase of this value chain, and finally you enter in commercialization, you will be covered by ABS regulations. Now, what UNCTAD has been trying to do to help on this, we have been working closely with UNCTAD and others. We have developed a first scoping study on facilitating BioTrade in a challenging access and benefit sharing environment. We have developed some policy recommendations. They were peer reviewed by a set of very high-level experts. We are producing right now a guide that is not ready, and we will issue it soon, potentially next year, early next year, where we will go step by step what can be done by companies to comply and at the same have clarity of what they should do. We are already training and doing capacity building activities in 2 countries, Peru and Vietnam. They have already happened, and we are providing another support in the drafting of legislation, regulations, and also something that people tend to forget a lot, administrative practice. Sometimes you might have the most beautiful law and the regulators are bad. Sometimes you have a bad law and the regulators are competent. So you might get always suboptimal results depending on how you manage the relation. Finally, as you could say, we have a larger base, which is commodity trade. It could be billions, it could be unsustainably sourced, examples, timbers, different type of timbers. You can have BioTrade that complies with certain sustainability standards but has a larger scope, and you can have ABS. They can be interrelated depending on who starts doing the research and development activity with what, where, and how. And then, depending on that, those questions, you might be found to have to comply with ABS regulations. Some companies want to close their eyes. Some companies are trying to comply willingly and trying to navigate through the system, but they always find difficulties in trying to understand all this complex ecosystem and landscape. With that, I leave the floor to my colleague, Bala.
Thank you. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I hope all the other attendees and participants in the webinar can also hear me. First of all, again, thanks a lot for joining us and being with us for the last half hour, where David was trying to give you a little bit of a better understanding of the principles of BioTrade, where BioTrade and ABS intersects, and the role of commodity trade. And what I'd like to do is to take on from here and look at it from the access and benefit sharing perspective. Because as many of you may be aware, with the entry into force of the Nagoya Protocol, we have quite a large number of countries who are in the process of developing national regulations, national frameworks related to access and benefit sharing. And as we are talking currently, even personally, I'm reviewing about 4 of such draft laws or degrees developed by countries. But one of the things we wanted to actually do through this particular webinar and also follow up with discussions at the forthcoming meeting of the parties, the COP-MOP of the Nagoya Protocol in Cancun in Mexico in December, is to provide a little bit more clarity for those countries who are in the process of developing national frameworks so that they understand the differences as well as the complementarities between these 3 elements that David had presented in his last slide, which is on the screen: commodity trade, BioTrade, and ABS. Next slide, David. The next one. Yeah. So let me very quickly recap in terms of the key links between BioTrade and ABS. And the reason why I'm just reiterating parts of what David said is that it is very critical for those of us working on ABS components in terms of developing national implementation frameworks to understand some of these elements a little bit more clearly. First, as David said, we have very limited guidance from Nagoya Protocol in terms of dealing with these issues. The protocol does not specifically mention of any of these issues. And that is why the interpretation as well as clarifying the relationship between commodity trade, biotrade based on the principles that David had presented, as well as the elements of access and benefit sharing, to a large extent is either poorly understood or not clearly understood or sometimes misunderstood also. And one of the challenges many countries, including countries who have been having the national access and benefit sharing frameworks for several years already, are facing is how do you differentiate between trade in biological resources at national level, biotrade, and access and benefit sharing. And the reason for it is that still there is limited understanding of the biotrade principles when it comes to discussions on access and benefit sharing. For those of you who have been following the Nagoya Protocol deliberations, negotiations, and adoption of the Nagoya Protocol in Nagoya, probably would be aware that we have had very limited focus on the issue of trade biotrade principles. So one of the reasons why such a kind of a lack of understanding is being reflected at the national level is the way countries have started defining certain very basic fundamental elements of the ABS framework. And one of the significant challenges that countries would face if they do not get clarity in terms of differentiating these principles while developing the national access and benefit sharing frameworks, whether they are legal frameworks or regulatory frameworks or even administrative frameworks, is to provide room for misinterpretation of words such as commercial utilization, extracts and derivatives, value addition, and others. So what I want to do in the next 10-15 minutes is to just quickly give you some very specific examples of how this kind of misunderstanding or misinterpretation is creating problems in terms of developing and implementing national ABS frameworks with respect to the Nagoya Protocol implementation. The next slide. So how do you differentiate biotrade and ABS? So in legal terms, access related to biotrade and ABS are two different concepts, although they may be mistakenly understood presentation very carefully. Even though it looked like the transition from biotrade to ABS is seamless, the way he presented, but certainly when you're looking at from the legality of the issues of biotrade versus ABS, definitely there are subtle differences that countries and the people who are working on developing the regulatory frameworks need to understand. To a certain extent, biotrade looks also at trade in biological resources, but access and benefit sharing looks at research and development and prospecting on resources. So that way, there is definitely a connection between trade and research and development and prospecting, value addition, and commercialization. So why countries are still trying to grapple with the idea of not able to differentiate between these principles is that there may be a potential misunderstanding where both of them involve a variety of value chain actors. And one of the slides David presented here clearly given you a bit of an example for that, where we have a collector, where we have somebody who actually provides some value addition by drying or doing a simple extraction, and that goes into a formal research and development process, and novel compound or a product is developed, and the ABS component kicks in. But to a large extent, not everything that is being used in terms of the value addition process from a biotrade angle will result in a commercial product that can lead to having an ABS component all the time. So definitely there are activities that will stop as being biotrade related activities, not necessarily getting into the ABS sphere, but to a certain extent there are a lot of biotrade activities which also get into the sphere of ABS. And unless countries are able to differentiate this particular fine line between trade in biological resources, biotrade, and ABS, you may have situations where countries will develop access and benefit sharing frameworks that either completely have a negative impact on trade in biodiversity of genetic resources or biological resources, or even biotrade, where you may have to have a lot of compromises on the way the principles are being implemented when it comes to biotrade. The second element of it is that activities that are involved in the utilization of genetic resources and the products derived may look very similar, because one of the slides again, David showed it looked like both of them seem to be similar, but each one is actually a step further. BioTrade is a step further from commodity trade. Access and benefit sharing framework related principles and actions are a step further from BioTrade principles and actions. So the purpose of this presentation is also to drive home the point that we need to have a proper understanding and differentiation of these principles as and when we are trying to put together national ABS frameworks. The next slide. Of course, David did give an example, but I just thought I'll recap that kind of an example. Like, say, for example, products from biological or genetic resources, extracts, natural dyes, which is used for production of soaps, cream, butter, moisturizers. All of this, the BioTrade component will stop to the extent there is supply of raw materials, natural ingredients to prepare such products. But the moment there is research and development in terms of having those extracts to get into a commercial product where profits are made, where ingredients are used for commercialization, then the ABS principles will kick in. And the same is for essential oils and natural medicines. The production under known or existing methods employing fair trade practices are covered by BioTrade. But if there is going to be research and development in terms of doing further activity for identifying specific compounds, specific products which can be used for commercialization, then the ABS principles will kick in. However, this differentiation of BioTrade and ABS to a certain extent can look a little academic at this point, but certainly that differentiation, whether to keep the differentiation or to override the differentiation, depends on the national legislation. I'll give you one or two examples of countries have kept the differences and countries who actually have overrun that particular differentiation, where everything that is also considered as under the principles of BioTrade is also being considered to fall under the ABS principles. In one way, countries are free to do what they want to do when it comes to developing a national ABS framework, but the only difficulty that would arise is to effectively implement the ABS regulations at the national level, because you are trying to put everything in one basket, whether it is trade or BioTrade or ABS into one basket, making the implementation a little cumbersome and making administering the implementation a little bit more cumbersome also. The next slide. So the key problem here is for countries to understand, or for people who are working on access and benefit sharing to clearly understand that you cannot cover any or all commercial uses of genetic resources under the ABS framework. If you start doing it that way, you will not only create conflicts between trade policies of countries and the implementation of the protocol, but you will also begin to undermine the objectives of ABS as it is elaborated under the convention as well as the Nagoya Protocol. Remember, trade in commodities or commodity trade in countries is actually an event as or an activity that is completely under the control and purview of ministries of commerce and trade. But however, I'm going to give you one example of where we should have some oversight on the activities related to commodity trade also from the perspective of conservation, from the perspective of ABS in a minute. But the key part of it is that if you are going to develop a national ABS framework where you try to generalize that every commercial activity related to using the biological or genetic resource to come under ABS, there are possibilities, there are dangers of you treading the line of ministries of commerce and trade, and you may end up in litigating and understanding and interpreting the elements of ABS rather than implementing the provisions or objectives of the protocol. The next one. So when it comes to commodity trade, as I mentioned, commodity trade is always promoted by countries and it contributes to both national and local economy. And commodity trade exists in both biological and genetic resources. And to a large extent, it is out of the purview of conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing in many countries. Because commodity trade is merely seen as collecting a lot of biological and genetic resources and simply exporting them or trading those resources. To a large extent, what is the impact of conservation, or what is the impact of that particular commodity trade on conservation? We have very little data and information. what is the impact of that particular commodity trade in terms of sustainable management and use of resources? Very limited information. And lastly, and most importantly, we do not have enough data on trade in monetary returns, which is generally vague. I'll give you one example. If you take a large number of countries, except for countries like the US or Singapore, a lot of trade in biological resources happen under 1 or 2 customs coding classification. In other words, countries may be trading hundreds of species of biological or genetic resources. They may be trading different parts of these species. They may be trading different components of these species, like, for example, it may be a dried powder, it may be the dried material, it may be an extract, it may be a kind of an oil or whatever it is. A lot of these things are being traded with no clarity on which species, in what form, and how it is being traded. To a certain extent, access and benefit sharing related issues need to be considering some of the elements of the conservation and sustainable use principles when it comes to commodity trade. And that is why, as and when countries are developing the ABS or access and benefit sharing frameworks, it is very important that they also consider what is the kind of activity, what is the kind of national policy and the national regulatory framework, if it is available in countries when it comes to commodity trade in genetic resources. Because you cannot have commodity trade that actually supports extraction and limited use of biological resources for commercialization. And on the other hand, you have an ABS framework that actually speaks about commercialization, conservation, and sustainable use. So it is very important that people who are working on ABS frameworks need to understand what the country priorities and policies are with respect to commodity trade and also biotrade, so that they can appropriately reflect adjustments with the national policies on trade and biotrade, as well as consider some elements into the ABS frameworks. The next one. So under the Nagoya Protocol, as mentioned before, there is no definition for commercial utilization. However, the protocol very clearly defines utilization, and the utilization definition means to conduct research and development on genetic and or biochemical composition of such genetic resources, including through the application of biotechnology as defined in Article 2 of the Convention. But at the national level, as mentioned before, people have actually used this particular definition in different forms and formats in terms of identifying either national priorities or many times not knowing the implication of defining both utilization and commercial utilization. And I'm going to give you 1 or 2 examples specifically of how countries have used this in terms of defining what is utilization and what is commercial utilization. That will have a significant impact in the way ABS will be implemented or how the Nagoya Protocol will be implemented. Next slide. Okay, I'll give you 4 examples. 2 of them are on this slide. There is one country that actually defines commercial utilization. That means end use of biological resource for commercial utilization, such as drugs, enzymes, flavors, fragrance, cosmetics, emulsifiers, oleoresins, extracts. But it also gives some exemptions. It says it does not include conventional breeding or traditional practices of use in any agriculture, horticulture, poultry, dairy farming, and all. The key challenge with this kind of a definition is that definition may look very broad and very inclusive with some exclusion clauses. But some of the words that are used in this definition are the ones which are creating significant amount of implementation challenge for the country which is using this particular definition for commercial utilization. The first and foremost element of it is that because it says that it is the end use of these biological resources for commercial use, people have started interpreting this particular definition to include everything that is extracted from a biological or a genetic resource to come under the purview of access and benefit sharing. So we have had in country that actually had defined or used this definition where people have actually taken the users of genetic resources to courts for litigation, for judicial interpretation of this definition, to the extent people have started suing people when they are using resources for extracting oil, for making using cocoa for chocolates, for using cotton for shirts, for using fruits for extraction, So it has gone to a level where the interpretation is actually becoming unmanageable when it comes to using commercial utilization as per this definition. The second difficulty that is also there is that it uses the term conventional breeding. And today we know when we want to interpret the word conventional breeding can happen today in 2 or 3 different forms. It can be artificial insemination, or it can be in vitro fertilization. To a large extent, if you ask those people who are practicing some of these aspects of artificial insemination, they will say that today artificial insemination has come to a stage that it is an established conventional breeding technique for animals. Whereas in vitro fertilization is still a kind of an activity that requires some kind of a scientific rigor and all that kind of a thing. So the difficulty this country had was, is artificial insemination or artificially animals that are bred using artificial insemination exempted from the purview of ABS or not? There is no way they can understand or they can differentiate, because a set of people say that it is conventional breeding because it has been in practice for the last 20-30 years. But there are others who say that no, it is actually not conventional breeding. And the same is also being questioned in terms of agriculture. So one of the difficulties that countries would have when they have this kind of an umbrella omnibus kind of a definition is that the implementation and the interpretation of it can be done by different people in different forms and fashions. And it is actually a bit of a caution for those countries who are trying to develop the frameworks to be a little cautious for using this kind of a definition. Let us take country B, where it defines utilization of genetic resources to mean to conduct research development on the genetic and or biochemical component of genetic resources, including through application of biotechnology. So very simply, in other words, this country had used the same definition more or less in different kind of a wording format of the definition that has been put in the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. But one of the challenge in terms of implementation or interpretation of this kind of a definition is that this again is a little broad, to the extent that we are looking at research and development on genetic material. So it does not, this particular country which developed or used this definition is not clear in terms of what is the commercialization element of such research and development and what kind of components of commercial component would be covered under the ABS regulation. So that part of it is completely silent when it comes to the ABS framework developed by this country which used this definition. Can I have the next slide? We have another country which very clearly defines utilization more or less to the same level as the previous country, but it also defines what is BioTrade, where it says that BioTrade means activities of collection, production, transformation and commercialization of goods and services derived from native biodiversity under the criteria of environmental, social and economic sustainability. So certainly this particular definition or the differentiation between utilization and BioTrade principles of it is going to be a little advantageous for the country, to the extent that those activities which are covered under the principles of BioTrade perhaps can continue to happen as and when the ABS principles will kick in is also clearly defined, and I have a slide to explain that, and this actually is a definition that is used by South Africa to make it very clear. Then we have another country, country D, which actually gets into a lot more of detail on commercialization, which is again different from the earlier 2 or 3 examples that we have had, where this country is defined, the draft ABS framework decree is saying commercialization means a set of activities. It says commercialization means filing of complete intellectual property right application, whether in or outside a country. So the first thing that will happen if you are actually looking at it from a legal perspective is that filing an intellectual property right application is not commercialization. Filing an intellectual property right application is a result of research and development, where the person who has done the research and development is trying to take certain rights over use of that material. So tomorrow if this country is going to adopt this definition in itself, the first thing is that they have to defend, in case if there is a legal interpretation of this particular definition, to say on what basis IPR application is considered commercialization. And it also says that obtaining or transferring any intellectual property rights. It also says commercialization means commencing clinical trials, product development, including conducting of research, market research, pre-market approval, and resulting products. And if I were to be arguing against this definition, I'm going to say that commencing clinical trials or product development is not commercialization. So far, I complete the clinical trials, I have a product, and the product is in the market which is being sold for a profit, or which is being sold for a price. So the reason why I gave you those four examples are to actually give you a bit of a differentiation in the way countries are now trying to interpret both utilization and commercial utilization from the perspectives of BioTrade as well as access and benefit sharing. The next one. And again, David mentioned about Brazil, but I just thought I will give you a little bit of a specific with respect to the country approach from Brazil, where it very clearly says that authorization to access for biodiversity for research and development, which until now, until the ABS principles were changed in 2015, granted by a national council will no longer be required. And certainly it is asking for companies to register non-online database, and benefit sharing previously negotiated from individual case will fall at the final product manufacturer. Sorry. The reason why this definition is important is that it actually talks about two things. One, it completely does away with the issue of prior access permit and things like that. It clearly says that there is an authorization required for accessing biodiversity. First, the second part of it is that unlike BioTrade, where there is a possibility for capturing the value of biodiversity for benefit sharing purposes at different stages of the transaction, because you can capture the benefit at the level of the person drying the material, a benefit can be captured at the level of somebody making a simple water or aqueous extract, or it can be captured at the level of product development. Very clearly, Brazil said that as far as access and benefit sharing is concerned, we are looking at value capturing or benefit sharing capturing only at one stage, which is at the final product manufacturing stage. And this kind of a clarity is extremely important because we have a lot of confusion in country like India when it actually provided the benefit sharing guidelines in 2014. The way the guidelines are developed were more in line with the principles of BioTrade, but then been translated and put in the context of ABS, where it very clearly the guidelines want to capture benefits at every stage of the transaction, because there are a large number of users and providers of the resources, and that is creating a huge confusion. And currently this entire guideline is being litigated in the high courts in India. The next slide. And again, as we mentioned, South Africa is a very good example where it clearly says, which is based on the May 2015 guidelines, that it says that among the new requirements required under ABS is that there is a requirement for a permit for BioTrade, and BioTrade defined as buying and selling of dried, powdered, sliced extracts of indigenous genetic biological resources for commercial purposes. Simple. So which means that they actually are trying to say what is the kind of use of biological material in developing the principles or using the principles of BioTrade, which actually combines with the intentions of having the ABS framework better implemented, where there is that differentiation between what is coming under the BioTrade component and what actually will start kicking in the ABS principles when it comes to implementation. Next one. So how do we complement these two? Because for those of you who probably are not too familiar with these two concepts, it may look very confusing because the line is a little too thin, as probably you can understand from the last 40 minutes of the presentation or 45 minutes of the presentation. But certainly there is a lot of complementarity, and what I'd like to do is very quickly give you 4 bullet points in terms of what are the complementing aspects of it. First, ABS could be used to achieve BioTrade as a means of livelihood for local communities, so that the principles of BioTrade in terms of socioeconomic development, sustainable use of biodiversity conservation can be achieved. Secondly, while applying the Nagoya Protocol obligations The businesses should also look for fulfilling other principles of BioTrade and thus promote BioTrade implementation in the value chains. So you actually are trying to complement implementing both of these principles together. The next one. BioTrade programs could develop local communities' capacities to engage with market and also commercial stakeholders in trade processes, because it actually helps them to deal with a lot of what I would call as a pre-ABS mechanism to be put in place. And that is why I say that this capacity could be coupled with sensitization of rights under the access and benefit sharing under the protocol, could prove enabling for communities or stakeholders to engage both with the accessors and users of genetic resources and associated knowledge through prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms. So certainly there can be a lot of complementarity between the activities of BioTrade and ABS. Next one. So given this, these are my two concluding slides, is that what is that countries could do, especially those who are looking at developing national policies on ABS or frameworks on ABS, is first ensure that the policy framework considers the specificities of the policies of trade and commerce and BioTrade. Please do understand and look at the principles and ensure that they are complementing each other, not contradicting each other. Second, it is very important to clarify the scope of the ABS framework from the purview of utilization that includes commercial utilization. Third, it is very important to differentiate commodity trade and commercial use from an ABS perspective. If there is no clarity on it, countries would only be litigating in terms of what entails trade and what entails commercial utilization from an ABS perspective. The next slide. Make ABS now more predictable. As I've given you an example, the exemptions and special conditions, don't make it too open-ended so that everybody can interpret to their own convenience, ending up in a lot more of time being spent on interpretation rather than implementation. The next important point is that ensure the focus is on promoting use, research and development. Because end of the day, remember, access and benefit sharing, our BioTrade is going to be useful for any country or any community. So far, people are trying to use the resource, provide value addition to the resource, and commercialize the resource so that they make a profit and the profits are appropriately shared through the benefit sharing principles with the people who are providing the resource. And lastly and importantly, provide for easy means to deal with non-commercial research and development. If there is no clarity at the level of national ABS frameworks, differentiating between commercial and non-commercial research and development, and if there is one blanket definition that speaks about research and development, not differentiating non-commercial and commercial, again it will end up in having a lot more of bottlenecks in implementing the conservation, research and development, education, and other economic purposes. And that is why during the negotiations in the Nagoya Protocol, we spent a lot of time to differentiate between non-commercial and commercial aspects of utilization of genetic resources, so that the Nagoya Protocol components can be very carefully developed, agreed upon, and implemented. The next slide. So what we like to do is that, given some of these issues need to be clarified now, with more than about 40-45 countries who are in various stages of developing the national ABS frameworks, depending on the responses we get from you today in terms of your questions, clarifications, or inputs that we get from you between now and end of November, we are looking at organizing what we call as an ABS clinic, which is more a kind of an interactive question and answer session, where we would like to bring together those of you who are interested in exploring some of these options further in terms of discussing specific issues and problems, exploring practical options to make ABS an innovative financing mechanism, and also identifying options for implementation of these principles that includes international treaty much better. We have not made any final commitments for organizing this, but we thought I'll alert you to this possibility. But having this particular thing organized in Cancun depends on the interests and the requests that we are going to get from those of you participating in the seminar, as well as those of you who are interested in moving forward the national ABS mechanism. Thank you very much. The last slide is just to thank you for your attention. Next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Bala. Thank you, Mr. Vivas. really interesting topic for the biodiversity practitioners, members of the NBSAP forum. I would like to invite all our audience to share the questions, doubts, or comments through the questions tab in the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. You can also raise your hand. We can open your microphone if connection allows. So I would like to invite the participants now. Please remember register or update your profile in the NBSAP forum. Send us your thoughts on the webinar topics you would like to discuss in upcoming sessions. I am just waiting for your questions. Dr. Bala, Mr. Viva, do you want to add or some other comments while our participants start sending the questions?
Just to mention that many of these issues, yes, Bala, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, David, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Not that many of these issues we are presenting here that will look quite theoretical have come in practice for companies dealing with commodities, dealing with nutraceuticals, dealing with biotrade, or doing research that really don't know when they have to comply with ABS. And authorities have been reluctant to give them guidance unless they make an ABS application. So companies sometimes don't know what to do.
Thank you, Mr. Vivas. Remember, you can send your questions through the questions tab in the control panel, or you can also raise your hand also from the control panel if you want to participate in this interesting discussion. Okay, it seems like there is no question.
It seems that we were too clear. We were too clear, Bala. We might have to be more confusing next time.
We may exactly be the opposite.
Exactly.
No, I thought that this is Christy Supples. I thought the presentation was excellent. I'm surprised we have no questions from the audience. I just wanted to encourage folks that this is a great time. Any question you have, no matter how big or small, about BioTrade. Oh, looks like we got one from Lisa. Great. This is a great opportunity for us to discuss with the experts the questions that you've been really wondering about.
Great. People can also present comments. It's not all the questions. They can say something.
Okay, we have some questions and hands raised, so I'm going to open the microphone for Ileana. Ileana, can you hear us? Ileana? Okay, it seems like we have some problems with the microphone. I'm going to open microphone from Rupan Mandal. Rupan, can you hear us? Rupan? Okay. I'm going to read some questions from Lisa Benjamin. Thank you for your presentation. It seems as if South Africa has included BioTrade under ABS principles by reviewing PIC and a material transfer agreement. Have they excluded commodity trading from ABCs in their law?
No, I don't think they have. I will have to check, but in principle, this type of informal trade and intercommunity is usually not covered by this type of rules, not even ABS. I don't know, Bala, if you have something to say there.
No, that's correct, because we do not have much of experience of countries trying to deal with it. But that is a very, very important element that countries need to consider as and when they are starting to develop the national frameworks on ABS.
Yeah, what you have in South Africa here, to complement Bala, is that they have formalized BioTrade. You have to have a BioTrade permit And with that, if you engage in one of the activities on ABS, you have to go to the ABS office and you also get your ABS contract.
Thank you very much. We have a comment from Monique Akudo. Thank you. This is not a question, but a comment. I am managing the biofilm project in Uganda, and the issue of ABS is one of the categories of forecasting the NBSAP.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
It says, I'm managing the biofilm project in Uganda, and the issue of
BioTrade or BioThing, what it's called?
biofilm, the biodiversity
I'll answer that, David. Yeah.
initiative.
Okay. Yes.
I'm managing the biofilm project in Uganda, and the issue of ABS is one of the categories for costing the NBSAP.
Of course, yes, because I'm glad that you are considering that. I would say not costing, but also as a financing mechanism. Because see, when the discussions on access and benefit sharing started, it also started as a kind of an opportunity for countries to start making use of the rich genetic diversity, biological diversity that countries have in terms of value addition and making benefits, so that such benefits can be plowed back for conservation action. So I would definitely encourage you to make use of this particular opportunity of using access and benefit sharing as an innovative financing mechanism. And if this particular person who asked the question can send an email to me, I can send a publication, a peer-reviewed article that we published 2 years ago that elaborates on how countries can use access and benefit sharing as an innovative financing mechanism. And certainly the next webinar would be on that particular topic, how to make use of ABS as an innovative financing mechanism. And there are some brilliant opportunities which countries so far have not even started exploring or using. And we've got at least one experience from India, yet to be implemented, but as an opportunity that can be used. So I would compliment Uganda for using or putting ABS as a part of the NBSAP process in terms of financing mechanism. There are huge opportunities, but you need to know how to translate that opportunity into an action that can raise resources on a sustainable basis for a country using ABS as a financing mechanism.
Says the same Monique, BioTrade is a critical issue in Uganda as a country that has just recently signed the Nagoya Protocol. BioTrade will be one of the key issues during the review of the ABS guidelines and regulation. Okay.
We're very glad. We're very glad that they have considered it, and certainly wish them good luck. And they can always get in touch either with David or me in case if they require more information or material or guidance.
Yes, go for it, guys.
Okay, we have a question from Ileana Lopez. She says, thank you for the excellent presentation. Dear Bala, could you please develop more in the different modalities proposed for the ABS clinic during MOP2? It sounds like a very interesting tool in support to countries developing the regulatory frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Eliana. I mean, essentially, as I said, that it is not a set idea. It's only something which I've just thrown into this particular webinar to seek some inputs and gauge the interest of participants. The idea behind this particular clinic is that because a lot of people who are working on ABS are going to be in Cancun, from UNEP, we're just wondering whether it will be a good idea to have an interactive question and answer session on some specifics related to ABS, because normally if you have a side event or a workshop, we have a series of presentations, 2 or 3 questions, and everybody claps and goes. But the idea behind this clinic is that there will be no presentation. It will only be a kind of a specific time that we are looking at allocating for addressing specific questions from participants in terms of issues related to ABS. So it will be more a kind of a one-to-one interaction in terms of clarifying some of the issues countries, experts, and practitioners would like to get clarity on with respect to ABS. So if there is enough interest and an indication which looks like from your question, Eliana, then we'll be more than happy to explore the possibility of at least having 2 or 3 lunchtime sessions during COPMOP, not as a side event, but as a special kind of an event where we would like to provide an opportunity for more interaction and question answer, using or having some experts present there to clarify some very specifics for countries who are working on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Bala. I have a question from Ayman Mohamed. Thank you for this very informative presentation. This is Ayman Mohamed, PLR Chambers, New Delhi. We work in public policy and legislative drafting. Going forward, how do you think developing countries can best develop frameworks that balance protection of native biodiversity with broader economic development priorities?
Very good question, but a little broad question, because when the convention was being negotiated in the early 90s, before it was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, one of the principles of including access and benefit sharing as an objective of this particular convention, and also having Article 15 of the convention, is to actually complement the traditional work conservationists do, which is in terms of protecting and managing the biodiversity and sustainably using the biodiversity. The third dimension of putting access and benefit sharing, not just as an ethical and a moral principle, but also as an economic opportunity for countries to explore in terms of using their genetic resources, was something which is based on the question or the premise of the question in itself. However, what happened was that the entire discussions then on in terms of defining the principles of access and benefit sharing, the Nagoya Protocol, and the subsequent implementation, there has been to a certain extent the shift from access and benefit sharing being a facilitative regime to explore, to maximize the use of economic potential of biodiversity for conservation and livelihood securities. The entire access and benefit sharing discussions became a regulatory discussion in terms of how the communities, the countries can shut the doors for prospective users of biodiversity. And that became a bit of a complete paradigm shift in terms of the mindset of a lot of people working on ABS. And personally, for me, working on this particular issue for the last almost 20 plus years, one of the fundamental principles of access and benefit sharing is that please make use of the resources that you have to the benefit of yourself as well as the communities around you. But when you're using it, use it with certain agreed or pre-agreed principles of how do you access the material, what do you do with the material, and how do you share the benefit with the communities that are providing you the material. So far that basic and fundamental principle is understood and agreed, and a facilitation regime can be developed at the national level, certainly access and benefit sharing can be both an opportunity for countries, but if it is not developed with an appropriate understanding and objective to contribute to conservation, contribute to economic development, we may end up having 100 plus countries with frameworks, but perhaps next 10 years we may not be getting any benefits that are going to be flowing, rather than many of the countries would only be looking at litigating, interpreting some of these principles or some of these definitions. So fundamentally, the idea of access and benefit sharing is it should contribute to conservation, it should contribute to better use of resources, but under certain agreed principles and terms and conditions. And that is what is prescribed under the Nagoya Protocol. But how countries can use the principles of the protocol, the articles of the protocol, to turn them into national frameworks is completely left to countries. Countries may want to have it too restrictive, countries may want to have it too facilitative. It is completely left to the countries. And that is the reason why some of these presentations we are making is essentially to request countries, be very clear of what you want to get out of this framework. Is it just a few dollars after 10 years of your investment? Or is it a sustained long-term benefit that can flow into the community using ABS principles? Then you can make a national ABS framework, work for conservation, work for economic development, and work for livelihood securities.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Vivas, go ahead.
No, I fully agree with Bala. I would say also that here I'm selling my own cheese, but I think we need to develop a BioTrade program in India. There was some exploratory work in Nepal by UNCTAD, by the way, and I think the opportunities for benefits, as you could see the numbers I gave you in BioTrade, can be quite significant and more immediate to local communities and with a higher level of impact on livelihoods. We also need to get benefits, obviously, from genetic resources, but due to the fact that it's linked to research and development, any benefit will come in the medium and long term, and you have to have a significant level of knowledge to be able to capture any potential benefit in that equation.
Thank you. We have another question. Thank you for the interesting presentation. The question from Daniela Juarez. Considering the close links between ABS and different economic activities, I wonder if, in addition to the examples presented, you see that countries are in general trying to develop a differential treatment for different economic sectors, or they otherwise use a general ABS framework under which all sectors are included?
I mean, I quickly respond to that. Definitely sectors need to be differentially treated. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that differential treatment is required for sectors. For example, when you're looking at the pharmaceutical sector, which uses genetic resources as a base for research development and product development and subsequent commercialization, the kind of investment that goes into doing the research and development and putting a product into the market is significantly higher, and it takes a longer term in terms of getting a product out for commercialization. So when you're looking at the benefit sharing principle to deal with that particular sector, it has to be different, for example, from a sector where you are not looking at a big pharmaceutical product which requires a large amount of research and development investment, but it is more like a kind of a simple traditional medicine with combination of products which does not require a lot of time or investments. That particular component has to be differentially treated. The second part of it is that if you take, for example, there are certain countries that actually want to regulate agricultural related activities under ABS. For example, if you want to take the agrobiodiversity sector, the seed sector, the sector actually has a large volume of production and sale, but the margin of profit or margin of benefits that they make is rather small. Compared to a biotechnology sector where the profit margin is very high, but the volumes of sales is very low. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to the extent that you want to have the same benefit sharing principle for a seed sector, for a pharmaceutical sector, to a biotechnology sector. Because each of the sector has specificities in terms of the investments they make, the time they take, and also the volume of sales and the profit margins they have in terms of commercialization. So some of these requirements will necessitate countries to differentiate these sectors rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach, which is not going to work. Neither it's not going to work in the interest of the commercial entrepreneur or the user, nor in the interest of the country that is trying to implement ABS.
Just to complement here, Bala, I again fully in agreement. It's funny because we have been working for a long time on the same matter. I just wanted to mention also that there will be in practice differentiation of key sectors, including, I can list them, but pharma, food, nutraceutics, cosmetic, personal care, botanical, ornamental, etc. But the level of negotiation, type of negotiation, type of benefits, period to generate any product is totally different in these three sectors. So even if you don't differentiate in the law, you will have to do in the contract or in the permit. That's one. Second, that countries are starting to differentiate access and benefit sharing in light of different authorities and the subject matter. For example, in Peru, the ABS authorities, you have one for wild land resources, including microorganisms. You have another for cultivated plants varieties, meaning potatoes and blah, blah, blah. And finally, for hydrobiological resources, meaning on the sea, lakes, rivers, etc. So there are different levels of specialization that are being generated as a consequence of the implementation of the protocol.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Lisa Benjamin. Are there any practices that you recommend from an administrative perspective to implement ABS and BioTrade development? Do you know of any countries that combine BioTrade and ABS in the same institution, and how do they liaise with ministries of finance or trade? Could you also give examples of the interaction between ABS and BioTrade in terms of raising capacity of local communities? It is a very interesting point. Thank you again for such interesting presentations.
Could you repeat it slowly because there were several questions in that?
Yeah, so sorry. There is 4 questions actually.
I was taking note, but it was too much. Tell me one at a time. I have the answers, but just help me to
Okay, so the
get
first
on
one is,
track.
are there any practices that you recommend from administrative perspective to implement ABS and BioTrade development?
Yeah.
Um,
Next.
The second one is, do you know of any countries that combine BioTrade and ABS in the same institution, and how do they liaise with Ministry of Finance or Trade?
Yeah.
The
Next.
third one, could you also give examples of the interactions between ABS and BioTrade in terms of raising capacity of local communities?
Okay, great. There is a 4, so that's it.
No, that's it.
Okay, great. Bala, can I take this one?
Absolutely, it's your fault. Really.
No problem, no problem. Look, I think. Thank you for the questions. They are very useful. Again, that helped me to underline the point that I made during the presentation, that do not only look at the law. Administrative practice, the attitude and the competence on the regulator can make huge difference in setting precedents and finding the right solution for each case. Now, in administrative practices, there are many ways to generate synergies between ABS and BioTrade. The first one would be that BioTrade is already generating benefits. So if you have a BioTrade company requiring for ABS, you could somehow recognize benefits already given and prime for consent already given and extend it within the scope of ABS. This means that you cannot make things too complicated. You cannot, as a company, benefit sharing for BioTrade, benefit sharing for genetic resources, benefit sharing for TK, they're going to get tired and go to the next country. So it might be too much. You might need to find a way to converge benefit sharing schemes, and as Bala said, make them investment schemes. There are other things. For example, there are many cases where access has already occurred. You can promote what I call a regularization or legal reconstruction history, by which even if they got illegal access, you can legalize it if they provide benefit sharing towards the future. You can also make shorter periods for negotiations of BioTrade when you are dealing with ABS contracts, so you fast track the process. Why? Because BioTrade is not a new activity. In ABS, the typical case of ABS, I want to do research on, let's see, mangoes, and I'm going to try to find a new beauty cream that will make the skin of men or women more beautiful and shiny. This implies analyzing an existing biological or genetic resources to find new properties or uses. The case of BioTrade, the business is already ongoing. It has been there forever. All countries have BioTrade. What happens is they are not applying the sustainability standards, which is what we need to have sustainable use and not just any use. So I think we need to mainstream and find these synergies in the practical applications. The second questions, the relationship, if we find BioTrade and ABS working in the same ministries, yes. You have the case of Peru. MINAM, the Ministry of Environment, has a person who is the focal point of BioTrade and develop and implement the BioTrade strategy. In the same ministry, you find the person coordinating all ABS authorities on focal point on Nagoya. They are just one office to the other. You find the same in Vietnam. You find similar in South Africa, etc. In relation to ministries of trade, what happens is the Ministry of Environment is in charge usually of the harvesting, ensuring there are sustainable practice in harvesting, low environmental impact, respect of all the collecting permits, local communities are compensated, etc. And then the Ministry of Trade comes in the marketing phase, helping to bring these products into the market, supporting communities, giving a credit, helping to formalize the products, to get the labeling, etc. So again, the value chain approach work here. You will have a higher level of participation of the Ministry of Environment in the lower stages of the value chain. As the inputs become products or intermediate products such as ingredients, then the role of the Ministry of Trade starts increasing. And in both Peru, South Africa, and Vietnam, there is coordinating between export promotion authorities and environment ministries. How to make work ABS and BioTrade and link it with local communities. In the case of BioTrade, local communities are always involved because they have to harvest or collect. The advantage is there they get the price immediately. They get salaries or price over the material. With ABS, as soon as somebody expresses an intent to do research and development, then they have to go back to the communities and get a new relation because it's a change in intent. So again, we need to ensure that this also happens so you find synergies between the both schemes.
David, just let me just compliment a brilliant explanation and answer from your side. But just only one small point is that not necessarily the principles of commodity trade that is supported and promoted by the Ministries of Trade and Commerce are in line with the principles of conservation and sustainable use.
That's true. That's true. No,
To a large extent, the Ministry of Trade and Ministry of Environment many times in many countries, even though it is not said very publicly, is at work for completely opposite goals. One looks at making profits using biological resource, not minding about the conservation and sustainable management principle. On the other one, which is only looking at conservation and sustainable management. And certainly, just as a kind of a self-promotion here, on 3rd of December, during the Business and Biodiversity Forum session, where UNCTAD and UNEP will be partnering to organize one session of that particular day in Cancun, we actually are going to be discussing a critical element of what is the current state of the trade policies in countries and the conservation imperative. And that particular element probably, Diego, it may be worth a topic for another webinar on its own, is that currently we have very limited information. Of course, there are a lot of economic research that has gone into that for countries to understand the principles of trade from a commodity perspective and principles of conservation from an ABS perspective that needs to be linked. And I'm more than happy to have another webinar specifically on that particular point because I've been doing some research and work on this for a couple of years now.
That would be awesome, Mr. Bala. Unfortunately, the time is over. Many thanks again, Dr. Bala, Mr. Vivas, for your time, and thank you all for your participation in this webinar.
Just take one point. If any of the colleagues have any questions, would you encourage them to write to us or write to you so that we can have more interaction in the future, in case if they have any more questions to be asked.
Definitely.
Yes, following up on that, we'll actually post an NBSAP forum thread with a link to the webinar recording and this presentation, and anyone with questions could put them in that thread, and then we could all benefit from the discussion. So you should receive that information by email on Friday at the latest, and then we hope that we can continue to have a lively discussion about the topic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all. Thank you for participating.
Okay, remember the second part of this webinar series next 25th of October, 9 a.m. New York time. The webinar is about integrating biosafety into NBSAPs and other conservation planning tools by Peter Deutman from Convention on Biological Diversity. Please check out our website to get the list of resources provided by this webinar. And remember, you can see the recording also from our site. I am Diego Ochoa from the NBSAP Forum. Feel free to send us your comments, suggestions, and recommendations on topics for our future webinars. I take your word, Mr. Bala, on the next webinar topic. I hope you all enjoyed these sessions. Please join us in our next webinar in September. Thank you very much, Mr. Bala and Mr. Vivas.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you, some of you participants in Cancun.
With tequila. See you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, bye.